This is A Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take it is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It means only that you can elect what you want to take at a given time. The course does not aim at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. This course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. Let's begin. This is a reading from chapter 17, Forgiveness and the Holy Relationship. We're on section 3 today, and we're going to read from section 3, Shadows of the Past. To forgive is merely to remember only the loving thoughts you gave in the past, and those that were given you. All the rest must be forgotten. Forgiveness is a selective remembering based not on your selection. For the shadow figures you would make immortal are enemies of reality. Be willing to forgive the Son of God for what he did not do. The shadow figures are the witnesses you bring with you to demonstrate that he did what he did not. Because you bring them, you will hear them. And you will keep them by your own selection.
And you who keep them.
Yeah, excuse me? And you who keep them by your own selection do not understand how they came into your mind and what their purpose is. They represent the evil that you think was done to you. You bring them with you only that you may return evil for evil, hoping that their witnesses will enable you to think guiltily of another and not harm yourself. They speak so clearly for the separation that no one not obsessed with keeping separation could hear them. They offer you the, quote, reasons why you should enter into unholy alliances to support the ego's goals and make your relationships the witness to its power.
You know, we did those other two topics, forgiveness and salvation, because we sense that going into this particular section, section 3, was challenging, and the language is challenging. And as a general goal for myself anyway, I would like to be sure that we understand what our true agency is in forgiveness and who these shadows are. Right. You know, and I think it's important to understand as much as possible, to understand the terminology used in the Course so that we can understand the structural implications of what it's saying.
Exactly.
So many times I've read about the shadow figures or this or that, and I really just throw it into a basket called poetic language.
Right.
And I don't recognize that it's using a particular term with particular qualities for a very specific reason. Mm-hmm. That's what I think now. So,
yeah, and the forgiveness that, as we mentioned in the other one, to forgive requires the calling in of the Holy Spirit. To try and forgive by oneself is always going to be a problem, because it ends up putting you in a position of a hierarchy of I can forgive and therefore I can pardon someone else and everything else, and that is not. So if you haven't saw the prior video on forgiveness, I recommend it, because it has to do with calling in the Holy Spirit, because with the Holy Spirit is why you're able to forgive.
And in there's a very interesting and I think very critical piece of the Course in Miracles of what is my agency? What is my role in forgiveness, in the sonship, in salvation, in the atonement? How do I participate? Because from the illusion, as I said in the last one, I think I said it clearly, but I also think it could be easily misunderstood to say there's nothing we can do. Because I think I said that.
Yes.
I think I said several times there's nothing we can do. And I can't really retract that because acting as cartoon figures, we are cartoon figures in a cartoon world.
Right.
Now, in that world,
it is the dream.
The thing that there's something that makes it light up. Okay, there's something that's a luminance within this cartoon world that we inhabit. Now, obviously, Fred Flintstone can't really do anything to Barney Rubble other than what they determined at Hanna-Barbera, etc. Cartoons have no agency, and we have no true agency. But within that cartoon figure, if you trace it back, now he has no ability to choose, but we aren't, the metaphor ends there, because we do have something resembling choice. Now, the thing is, even that, in other places becomes a sketchy thing. It's like Jesus, in the book, he says, I create this urge in you. Jesus actually implies that the author of this.
Because the spark is in each and every one of us.
The spark is in us, but it must be addressed from somewhere, because we would live with that spark being nothing but the luminance of the cartoon. And we would live out our cartoon lives learning very, very, very slowly, slowly. And the Course is saying we can quickly wake up to what our lack of agency is. In other words, there's not really, we don't really have that much we can do here. However, we have very powerful tools provided by the Holy Spirit that we're unaware of, right?
Yeah, and the movement is always a decision for willingness, a willingness to see things differently, a willingness to lay down that which is in the way of a forgiving thing being healed. Meaning, I'm willing to let go of my idea of what either I did or the other person did unto me, so that it can be revealed in a new way, because otherwise it will never work. But to forgive is merely to remember only the loving thoughts you gave in the past and those that were given you. Again, who is remembering? I mean, as we mentioned in another time, mostly we remember that which was done unto us out of upset, things that caused us upset or anger or fear and all those kind of things. Do we really remember the loving things?
I know, but the Course here says immediately, makes the very enigmatic statement, very enigmatic, mysterious statement. Forgiveness is a selective remembering based not on your selection.
Right.
Who's remembering? What is remembering?
That's why I brought up the question.
Who's steering memory in this situation?
Right. And so let's just say we might not be able to remember that. So we're going to continue on with all of this. Also, it says all the rest must be forgotten. It's like, okay, now to forget the things that were done wrong to me or that I have done wrong to others, based on judgments, guilt, and all those kinds of things. I can probably, if I wanted to, capture those and say, okay, let me look at this one, let me look at this one, let me look at this one. And if I wanted to line them all out, what I thought was transgressed against me or that I did against others, I could probably bring those to memory, at least in a certain amount, and then look at each one and say, will I be willing to forget?
Well, what good is it? What are you doing?
Well, that's just it.
Okay, this is the thing. Let's say simply stated, let's say I step on your toe. That really happened here in the dream. I really stepped on your toe. Now, the Course is asking me not to call that to mind and say it didn't really hurt, her intentions weren't there.
Right.
It's really more along the lines of, the act of stepping on a toe is not real somehow.
Right.
Now the thing is, that's obviously another layer. And we need to get into it. And
Okay.
before we go into it, I just want to be clear, because I think this idea of shadow figures, for the shadow figures you would make immortal are enemies of reality. And like I said, I've always viewed shadow figures. I think these shadow figures, it's important to understand the structural implication of what these shadows are, because they're referred to several times.
Right.
There's not enough really information in this paragraph to go there.
Right. Okay. And then let's just go down just a little bit further, because it was a long paragraph. Let's just see, because you bring them, you will hear them. Okay. Again, it's referring to the shadow figures. They represent the evil that you think was done. You bring them with you only that you may return evil for evil, hoping that their witness will enable you to think guiltily of another and not harm yourself. So this is to pass it off onto someone else. This is how the ego, it's explaining how the ego works. They speak so clearly for the separation that no one not obsessed with keeping separation could hear them. So obviously it's indicating that we are obsessed with keeping separation most of the time. And we do like our shadows. It's how we actually orient ourselves.
But we are obsessed with the separation. It's critical to our survival here. In cartoon land, it is critical that we be separate, have separate. Because if we are joined, it's like a bunch of anvils chaining themselves together and throwing themselves in the ocean. We have no confidence in what unity does when it comes right down to it.
Because unity cannot be done bodies with bodies. And so
Exactly.
it will go into that. As separation, we're talking about separation from God here. That's what it's all about. The ego doesn't have an identity without its separation from God.
It is these shadow figures that would make the ego holy in your sight and teach you what you do to keep it safe is really love. The shadow figures always speak for vengeance, and all relationships into which they enter are totally insane. Without exception, these relationships have as their purpose the exclusion of the truth about the other and of yourself. This is why you see in both what is not there, and make of both the slaves of vengeance. And why whatever reminds you of your past grievances attracts you and seems to go by the name of love, no matter how distorted the associations by which you arrive at the connection may be. And finally, why all such relationships become attempts at union through the body, for only bodies can be seen as means for vengeance. That bodies are central to all unholy relationships is evident. Your own experience has taught you this. But what you may not realize are all the reasons that go to make the relationship unholy. For unholiness seeks to reinforce itself as holiness does, by gathering to itself what it perceives as like itself. So holiness and holiness is wholeness. Unholiness is fragmentation, the separation, basically. The separation, the separated state, the egoic mindset wants constant reinforcement of clear boundaries, separations, differences between things, so that I can cut away the bad and keep the good. Cut away the bad
And it's built off of guilt and fear.
Okay.
Because you have to understand the separation immediately caused the sense of guilt and the sense of fear of being separated from that which was whole is no longer whole in the mind. It's the only place that it's not whole of the egoic mind. So,
but again, to an egoic mentality, which is the mind that runs this place, that guilt and fear, the only way to get rid of guilt and fear is to do your best to expiate, to get rid of it, by some form of a sacrificial lamb or a goat, or, to cut it off yourself.
Or to blame it on someone else.
Yeah, to blame it on someone else,
Yes.
or isolate yourself from it. So separation is the only solution we know here to clean ourselves of that guilt.
Right.
And it just increases it.
And forgiveness is the only solution. So let's talk a little bit about those shadow figures and the way that they play out in relationships. We had the discussion about how if you were to trace any upset that comes up in your life and stuff like that, you can almost always trace it back to origins of family or non-family, whatever raised you and things like that, the first time that you felt this particular way. And what happens is we associate that with our sense of identity. So now if someone calls you, stupid, and that you're never going to ever amount to anything, we will then reinforce ourselves with that idea from a teacher, from a boss, from someone in your life. And so those come back because we grew to identify with the thing that was told us when we were, so vulnerable.
Well, as the Jesuits say, give me a child before the age of 7 and I have them for life.
Right.
In other words, what I have been conditioned with by the age of 7, whether that's from a daycare center or from my parents or from an aunt or uncle or just being abandoned, whatever I decided about the world by the age of 7 is like 85, 90, 95% of my personality, and it's very, very much a part of my inner architecture.
Right. And so let's go back to this sentence 3. Without exception, these relationships have as their purpose the exclusion of the truth about the other and of yourself. This is why you see in both the other and yourself what is not there, and make of both the slaves of vengeance. Because anything that reminds me of that thing that either causes littleness, or I instead of going to littleness, I decided to make myself grandiose to overcome my littleness. All of these things are going to make a sense of vengeance towards myself or the other. And so it's a lot of, I know I'm pulling traditional sort of psychology speak into this, but it's the only way that I personally know how to take what the Course is saying, because the egoic mindset just works in this particular way. And we don't even realize the patterns that we draw back into ourselves to resolve, and we call it love. We call it love because we are trying to find love where it is not.
Love, as I said in earlier ones, trying to understand God as love and all that. And I've decided that love, it's easier to understand love as a form of gravity than it is, some sentimental feeling of schmoozy thing.
Right.
In other words, as gravity. In other words, what attracts, what is pulled because of values. And so the ego has something that it feels is love, an attraction to the things that make it feel justified, that make it feel stronger, that make it feel valid. It's the same things that the Holy Spirit would say, the things that are your true identity. The ego seeks a quote-unquote true identity through its falsehood, through its separation, through its identification of differences, in a similar way that the Holy Spirit wants us to seek our true identity as the Son of God, as in the sonship.
Yes.
That is our true identity. Now, the tendencies are the same. The means, the methods, and the outcomes are the opposite.
Right, because that very last paragraph was for.
Let's go into shadow. What is a shadow? Shadow is an object cast on the ground because the sun, excluded. You take your form, and I got 10 fingers, 10 toes, whatever. My ears, my baseball cap, whatever I've got. The sun hits me, and it casts a void spot on the ground. That's a shadow, and it's quite amazing when you really think about it. If you can get a child's mind and say, look at that creature, that shadow on the ground. It moves like it's alive. It's got ears. It's got the baseball cap. Mm-hmm. Now, it's kind of a funny outline, which is another aspect of its charm. It's kind of like exactly the same, but not really. It's just an outline. That's what a shadow is. Now, what are these shadows from the past? The shadows from the past are something happened to me. I say that it happened via some person, it's historical or whatever, but I isolate a painful moment. Let's say I have an interaction with a mother or father or uncle or someone, and that's an isolated moment.
Mm-hmm.
The ego grabs that as something that reinforces some idea that it's got going. It grabs it as reinforcement. So it trims that, and that's like a shadow of that other person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you've got that other person or that event, and you have strained it off, and you have gotten just an outline of something that functions a lot like a ghost. You grab that, you collect it. Now, let's say I'm in a reaction, and let's say that was my mother, and I've got a shadow from her being, let's say, critical of me in some way. And then Joanna is sitting here, and when I'm, according to the Course, when we got together in egoic terms, in 3D space, the reason for the union is so that I have basically something that I can lay those shadows on. I want someone to flash those back at me. It's an automatic aspect of the separation.
Yes.
Okay? I'm not confessing something here other than that I'm a physical being living in a physical universe.
Right.
It's not an intention that we do. It's the way this place is built. So for me to reinforce myself, I need reinforcement from those shadows. She was critical this time. There was a school teacher that then was critical of me. I collect her shadow, and I relate it back to the shadow that was collected from my mother. So I have these shadows. You can see that they don't really have an identity other than that they attacked me somehow in my own mind.
In your own mind. That's the key. It's in your own mind.
In my own mind. So then when I get together with Joanna and she says some trigger phrase that I can interpret, and I'm looking for that interpretation. Mm-hmm. I'm seeking that interpretation because in the egoic terms, I want that validation. Why? Because we're shaped up to the age of 7. Okay?
Right.
So I want that validation based on that kind of conditioning that's very old, very entrenched. So she makes some sort of a statement, and that despite all the gazillions of loving gestures that she makes toward me, I isolate that one, and I take that opportunity to pull all those shadows and lay them on her.
And now they all come back like a pancake.
Yeah, and now it's a pancake. Now I've got the shadow. This is what it means. It just maybe we'll develop it more.
Boom, boom.
It's important, I think, to understand the structural implication of these shadows as wraiths, as almost alive entities that they're only in my mind. They exist nowhere. They didn't exist in my mother. Mm-hmm. As an isolated event, that rejection, that according to the Course, later on, it says, I don't know, maybe it's one of the lessons.
And the reason why it's a dream is because it does not occupy the mind of God. It's not in the mind of God. These are our outside of the mind of God sort of thoughts. Only the goodness and the love and the thing that you call gravity that causes the sense of wholeness is in the mind of God.
It's an interpretation.
Yes.
And, it's the egoic interpretation of something. And being that it's the egoic interpretation, it's simply wrong. But in terms of it being real or unreal, the mind of God provided us that projection of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Which makes all of them correct, right, healing.
Yeah, it causes
it's
a healing.
the atonement.
Yes.
All of those, my understanding of all those events constitutes the atonement. What was the definition of the atonement? An interlocking chain of forgiveness.
Yes, an interlocking chains of forgiveness, so that they're all...
That's what the atonement is.
Right.
So I have these shadow figures. And I'm laying them on the other, and I collect them up. The Course mentions in other places that it is important, really, and I don't know if it's in this chapter or elsewhere, to go into the past. What did it say? The past is central to the atonement.
Yeah, that's
the past.
Yeah, we were looking up in the concordance where atonement was speaking of those things.
The past is central to the atonement. And you'd say, no, the past, let's throw the past away. No, the Course is saying the past is central to the atonement. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Does it mean the past in terms of 1848? Does it mean the past in terms of when I was 6 years old? Does it mean what past? I'm going to say that the past is, again, an interpretation and an orientation. And it's important to go back, not to heal our situation here. It doesn't get healed here. I have shadows on Joanna. She has shadows on me. And these shadows...
And they reflect back.
These shadows will box each other without landing a blow. And we will stay locked in that shadow fight forever. Creates a lot of pain, and it goes nowhere.
Right.
So that's why it says that the past is central to the atonement, is because I say, okay, this is not happening now. This is unreal. This thing we have going is unreal. So let's go back into the past. That doesn't mean I start analyzing everything that happened to me in a psychological manner, even though that might be involved. It means I recognize that this is an emanation from before. I think it is important to recognize that the wound I feel today is very, very similar to the wound I felt before I ever met Joanna.
Right.
And it was very, very similar to that I felt before I even could, was in high school or before this. Just to recognize that there's a pattern of these shadows that go back and back and back. And that the goal here would be to find the source of the wound in the separation itself at the very start of everything.
I'd like to share that one memory
ahead.
of mine. So I was in a breakup, my first young breakup, engaged, and then to be married, and then it didn't happen. So when he called it off, I was devastated, and I just cried. I had panic attacks and everything else. But the main thing that I decided to do, and I don't know actually how I remembered to do this, but anyway, I did some mirror work. And I sat in front of the mirror, and all I remember is rocking like a child, and saying, please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. And suddenly, I was actually taken back to a past memory. I'm not even going to go through all of that, but not this lifetime kind of past memory with this person. And then after that was all done, I recognized that the thing that started with an abandonment, which was what that's felt like the most severe abandonment that I could have, a loved one is now going to ditch me. I actually had the recognition that the first abandonment was abandonment from God. So that memory, even though it didn't help me in other relationships, I mean, it was at the time, it was quite a revelation for me. I was like, oh my gosh, that was the first time that I felt lost and separated, was all the way back from the very, very beginning. So every time that we have, these things that play out in this realm, in the dream world, in the illusion, it all goes back to the idea that we thought that we could separate. And because we thought we could separate, we took on the idea of of guilt, and that there must be a punishing God, that I do require punishment for this. And now this world is here, and we are in different relationships like this and everything else, and we act out in different ways the vengeance now, because the ego has some sovereignty, quote, in its own made-up world. It doesn't want to give it up. It does not want to give it up, no matter how great it would be to be at one with God again. No, it doesn't want to give up that particular form. And so it ends up with these other forms that are shadows, and it keeps it going with fear and guilt and fear and guilt. In the unholy relationship, it is not the body of the other with which union is attempted, but the bodies of those who are not there. For even the body of the other, already a severely limited perception of him, is not the central focus as it is, or in entirety. What can be used for fantasies of vengeance, and what can be most readily associated with those on whom vengeance is really sought, is centered on and separated off as being the only parts of value. Every step taken in making every step in the making, the maintaining, and the breaking off of the unholy relationship is a move toward further fragmentation and unreality. The shadow figures enter more and more, and the one whom they seem to be decreases in importance.
And the one in whom they seem to be, in whom. It's not the one whom they seem to
Yeah,
be. It's the
it's
one
one
in whom they
seem
seem to be.
decreases
Now, that's
in
an
importance.
important preposition,
Yes, it is.
because in whom they seem to be. The shadows, in other words, in that scenario I was painting with Joanna, of let's say I have these shadows from the past. They're actually filtered out, trimmed out fabrications of my own mind to reinforce my identity. And part of that identity is that people don't understand me, people don't listen to me, people don't support me. And so I have these various shadows that I have collected over time. So that's what I have. Now, I want to lay them on Joanna. Now, the deal is they seem to be in her. When we have our tiff, she doesn't say, let's say she says something to me about this or that thing. I don't say, there's my mother talking, and if I do, it's an insult to her. I'm not really trying to get at my mother.
Right.
I'm not really trying to get at my 6th grade teacher. Mm-hmm. I'm not really trying to get at anybody. In fact, I want Joanna, and this is what it's starting to get into, I want her as far out of the game as possible. So you can see the thing where I've got all of these bodies, quote-unquote bodies that I've collected.
Shadows.
Shadow
figures.
They're kind of like bodies, but it's a trimmed off, filtered out chunk of something from the past. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there, but it is a body. It's a wannabe body. And when Joanna's there and those things seem to be in her, she doesn't figure in there at all. Mm-hmm. And so what ends up happening is, and I think it gets into this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've read this section so many times, that what happens is those people in our lives end up being like coat hangers for these shadows. The person is irrelevant. The only thing that you want them to, you'll yell at them, you'll get mad at them, you'll divorce them, you'll want to hit them, you'll want to run out of the room. But in the end, you're fighting shadows. Yes. That's all you're fighting is shadows. And that person's only value to you that's sitting across the table isn't the one you think you got together with. You got together with a coat hanger for all those shadows, and that's their value. Mm-hmm. That's their value. And so that, those fights that you're having can't end. They can't end because you're not fighting that person. If you were really fighting that person, you might actually make some progress.
Right.
But you're not. You're fighting shadows. And in that kind of a game, nothing can happen. I think it's important to understand why that the ego and its techniques, in this case, shadows of the past, it has technologies, it has means and methods to stagnate your conflicts.
Yeah, to actually not, to leave it just enough under the surface that you don't even realize that is the thing that is occurring, that you're fighting with the shadow. It seems like it's really the other person. It's really their way of being and everything else. But we come together with beings, whether, like I said, whether they're bosses, parents, children, loved, in a loving relationship, a special relationship, whatever special relationship is there. And we continue to reinforce the shadows of the hurts of our past. It's how the ego has life. It really is.
Well, John Carpenter, the director, has a movie called The Thing, which is hard to watch. I've only watched it on YouTube a little bit. It's a sci-fi horror movie about an alien presence that occupies bodies, and it's just the most monstrous special effects. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, no one in this movie is safe, ever. Not from the beginning, not to the end. No one can be safe. Not anybody who's speaking, not anybody who's speaking to someone. There's no safe ground because the alien is a kind of a virus, and it resides in they don't know who. They don't know who it resides in until it arises as this thing, and then it's like use it or lose it, and it'll just come ripping out of this person and eat somebody else or do this other kind of a thing. This is the problem with the shadows. Mm-hmm. Joanna and I, let's say we have that tiff, this fight, this conflict, and we say, oh, we've grown up, we're healed, we're doing the course, we fixed it. And
we're beyond that.
Right, we got over that bump in the road. But the thing is, like in John Carpenter's movie, neither one of us are safe because it's a shadow that's at work. It's not really her. and it's not really me. We're talking about shadows. And that shadow, until we understand that shadow and heal it in the atonement.
Yeah, it heals the past in the present.
Yeah, until we heal until we get at it, the shadow in the atonement, that shadow is, I would say alive and well. It's dead and sick. It's dead and sick, not alive and well. The shadow is dead and sick.
Right, and the only thing that can help that is the Holy Spirit. It is the calling in and actually, at the very least, a relinquishment of your idea of your rightness, your judgments, or whatever about it, and say, I'm willing to see it another way. That is where I call that it is a call to the Holy Spirit. You don't have to say, Holy Spirit, if you even said, I want to see this another way, which is what Helen Schuckman said in order for this book to even come about.
Right. She didn't address the Holy Spirit per se.
No.
Right.
It was just that you're willing to see it another way. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good for the other person. It doesn't feel good for you. And you just want to see it another way. Those are invitations. Okay. And that's to be aware of that.
So paragraph 4, time is indeed unkind to the unholy relationship, for time is cruel in the ego's hands, as it is kind when used for gentleness. The attraction of the unholy relationship begins to fade and to be questioned almost at once. Once it is formed, doubt must enter in because its purpose is impossible. The ideal of the unholy relationship thus becomes one in which the reality of the other does not enter at all to spoil the dream. And the less the other really brings to the relationship, the better it becomes. Thus, the attempt at union becomes a way of excluding even the one with whom the union was sought, for it was formed to get him out of it and join with fantasies in uninterrupted bliss.
Quote,
okay,
bliss.
This is a puzzling series of statements, and I'm going to try, having read this several times, to make a shot.
I do want to say that the purpose was that the ego thinks it can be in union, and because it's bodies with bodies, union is actually impossible, because the only way union happens is with that which is the Christ in me unifies with the Christ in another, which means that it's unified with Christ everywhere, or the Holy Spirit everywhere. It's an all-in-one. So bodies do not actually do union.
I don't know if you've ever been in a downward spiral of emotions and toxic emotions and things. I certainly have been in a downward spiral of toxic emotion. And this idea that I can... there's no way out physically. You have that sense. I'm talking from personal experience. There's a sense that there's no physical solution possible. You become so reinforced into a mirror, a hall of mirrors in the mind of voices from the past, wounds from the past, inadequacies, whatever they are. They reify one another in a kind of a weird hologram, to where I become more and more real in my tortured state.
Yeah, it's that Harry Nilsson song, going down in the hole.
Yeah, going down, down, down to the bottom of the hole, going down.
You just keep going down.
and so, now what that is, it's saying that what happens, it says it here, that as soon as I enter the unholy relationship, as soon as I decide not to address Joanna in the now, in the real, in a holy relationship, and inviting in the Holy Spirit, whatever this entails, of trying to let this be a window into the healing, the atonement for us and for everyone, and all this. Until that happens, then she is an opportunity for me. It says that the reality, this line here, the ideal of the unholy relationship thus becomes one in which the reality of the other does not enter in at all to spoil the dream. And the less the other really brings to the relationship, the better it becomes. And it's talking about the bliss. The bliss is really, it's in quotes, it's a form of hell. The bliss it's describing is a form of hell, where I'm in my own hall of mirrors. All of them are my possessions. So that in a sense, in a psychotic state, I can actually become very possessive of these tortuous voices that come at me from my past. You're not good enough. You did this. They did this to you. And that I have the sense of being an unjust victim, and that it's a very strong, and there's a kind of a bliss there of I'm a victim, the victim of victims. It's what they tell us Jesus is. The victim of victims. And so that's where I find a form of bliss. That's what we're talking about. And the only way that I can really have that perfection, it's the heaven of the ego is hell. The heaven of the ego is hell. And it's where my whole world is populated by nothing but shadows. And there's no reality to punch a hole in it. Because in reality, there's a possibility to get out. Even though this is, let's say, an unholy relationship, it's closer to the source. This illusion here is closer to the source. But for me to be locked in my own mind with all of those shadows from the past, it can be very difficult. I think that's what chronic depression going out is.
Yeah,
it's just the burden of being crushed by shadows and no way to understand how to. You can't expiate shadows with shadows.
No.
And you develop a strong distaste for reality.
Yeah, and even to try to do it by yourself. This is why it is helpful, very helpful, to understand or have the deity, the God, the Holy Spirit, as understanding is in partnership, that you can do a partnership with that which is actually part of what you already are, the truth of who you are, identified with as your God self. So only in that alliance is any healing really taking place.
So we get back, let's jump back to this whole idea where I said you can't forgive. Okay, I don't have the agency to forgive in this world. But what you just said there, forgiveness yet is our function.
Yes.
Forgiveness is my only function. That's the axiom of the Course. So what does it mean then? I'm going to say it's an orientation towards seeing the past as possibly healing and not a storehouse of the mind of shadows and hurts and wounds and failures. It's the past as a possible solution in there somewhere in the mysterious way that only with the Holy Spirit as guide can I actually maneuver that journey into the past. If I open up the past with the idea that I'm going to solve or fix or whatever, well, that's what the ego wants you to do anyway, because it's an endless, you're on the couch forever, in the Freudian stagnation of just trying to figure out what's wrong.
In all honesty, I know people who you could almost call it an addiction to being able to keep rehashing their past with a psychologist, but it doesn't get healed. It just gets rehashed and rehashed and rehashed because it doesn't go that next step of having where you let it go through the spiritual journey of saying, I lay it down at the feet of Jesus. I call my alliance in with the Holy Spirit, and I say, I want to see it another way.
Well, in this paragraph 5, it actually drags the Holy Spirit in.
Okay, let's do it.
And paragraph 5 begins, how can the Holy Spirit bring his interpretation of the body as a means of communication into relationships whose only purpose is separation from reality? What forgiveness is enables him to do so. This is paragraph 5. Please tune in to the next section, which I'll probably release tomorrow, to continue this exploration of shadows, and though they don't exist, they can be frightening, and how we deal with them. Thank you very much. See you soon.